Good afternoon, everybody from New Delhi, India. Welcome to the Cake and Pie Expo. This is track 2, and this is the presentation by the team Arunodaya on the mucormycosis and other pandemic issues affecting ophthalmology practice. We have the honor of introducing one of India's leading pioneer ophthalmologists, Dr. Gulapalli Nageshwar Rao. Dr. Gulapalli Nageshwar Rao requires no introduction at all. He is the founder chairman of the world-famous L.V. Prasad Eye Institute. Dr. Rao was trained at the All India Institute and then went to the United States, where he specialized with Professor Acquavella in cornea. He came back to set up one of the finest institutes India has seen, and anybody who's been to L.V. Prasad will tell you that it requires a lot of sweat and a lot of dedication to create an institute like that in the heart of Secunderabad and Banjara Hills, and to be able to not only do quality work, but to be able to reach out to the community in various different forms of a pyramidal system, which is now being copied across the globe. Apart from that, we have other speakers here, which include the team of Arunodaya. One is, I would be speaking on the Arunodaya concept. Then there will be a talk by Dr. Aditya Sethi, a pediatric ophthalmologist, and the Arunodaya battle plan to tackle COVID. Then we have a very interesting talk by Dr. Denny John. Dr. Denny John's background is that he was originally working at the L.V. Prasad team, and now he sort of is a consultant in health economics and is associated with the Amrita Pritam group in Cochin. And he's been involved with a lot of our talks on the economic aspects of healthcare, and especially eye care, and where we are heading. Then we also have a talk on mucormycosis. Those of you who have been reading a lot about the complications of COVID and the effect of the black and the white fungus and how it's affected the ophthalmologists. So we have a talk on that by Dr. Parul Lokwani. So I'll now request Dr. G.M. Rao to please start his talk on the impact of COVID-19 on ophthalmic practice. Dr. Rao, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a country with a significant magnitude of the problem of blindness and vision impairment. Almost nearly a quarter of the world's problem. In the pre-COVID era, India has made significant progress in many areas. We have improved both the quantity and quality of cataract care. We have developed newer and better approaches for the delivery of services for undercorrected refractive error. We have made subspecialized services available throughout the country to a greater degree, improved the eye banking system across the country, and we have also developed appropriate framework for such complex problems as diabetic retinopathy, retinopathy prematurity, glaucoma, and a beginning to focus on the problems of children's eye health. In the area of eye care education, we have increased the number of programs in the past 2 decades and also significantly improved the quality of education for eye care personnel. And we have begun successfully over the past few years, and increasingly so in the past 2 years, online education programs. As far as infrastructure is concerned in India, we have models for all levels of care, from primary care in the remote, rural, and tribal areas to secondary care in bigger villages and district level, and some of the world-class tertiary centers and outstanding ophthalmologists practicing tertiary care in the cities. So India has indeed become a leader in eye care among the developing countries over the past 2-3 decades. We have also more recently begun to leverage the benefits of technology that includes innovations and developments in medical technology, information technology, and mobile technology. India also has produced models of high degree of sustainability of the eye care programs through internal generation of revenues, through cross-subsidization models, support and subsidies from the government, where Indian government has made significant commitment for the prevention of blindness programs for nearly 35-40 years now. And we also have the presence of very successful non-governmental organizations across the country, which pioneered the development of many eye care delivery models. In addition, we received significant additional support from the international non-governmental organizations from around the world. And philanthropy has always been a part of India's tradition, and this has become much bigger in the recent years, particularly with the government's policy of CSR, corporate social responsibility. So together, all these streams of support in terms of funding have helped the eye care to develop significantly in the country. However, with the onset of COVID at the beginning of last year, we have faced a major crisis. And the current situation because of that is a significant drop in volumes in the first half of last year for everybody. There was significant disruption of education programs, and some programs even closed down. There was a lot of concern for people working in eye care segment about their employment and the continuity of employment and growth opportunities. We lost valuable human resources in which many organizations have invested over the years. And finally, there was a significant threat to sustainability of the existing organizations. The screening programs, which have been the traditional way of providing care in the remote, rural, and tribal areas in the country, have been disrupted, and so were the eye camps and mobile programs. The eye donation program has taken a big beating, with the total number of corneas harvested during the past year falling to nearly 30% of the previous year. Yet another problem that adds to the complexity of the issue is the lack of follow-up care that is so critical for the success of corneal transplants, for the care of glaucoma patients, many retinal problems, and many other complex tertiary care problems. The lack of follow-up care led to advanced disease in many of these people with these problems. And all this together has added to the backlog, and we are going to face the problem very soon. There has been a significant impact on the quality of care because of the poor follow-up care that we have been able to offer to many patients, since travel has become extremely difficult. And also the complexity of some of the tertiary care problems with no follow-up care have added. Together, we are going to face many new challenges as we go into the future. So the overall impact of COVID till now has weakened our eye health system and increased the backlog of cases of both blindness and vision impairment. So what are we looking at post-COVID? And I believe we have to develop and grow what I believe a 3T model, where you bring about optimal alliance between talent, that is talented human resources, along with leveraging the best of technologies that can improve the quality of care and also improve the reach of care. And to these elements, since we are healthcare professionals, we should never forget the third element of tenderness, that care element. That would be the future. In addition, it's also very important to build local capacities of all existing facilities in whichever sector they are in now. We have ophthalmologist force of nearly 30,000 people. And I believe at least 2/3 of them would be competent surgeons. How do we maximize their utilization to be able to distribute care around the country, not concentrate in big cities? We have to focus on education And also tell our next generation their opportunities are not just limited to clinical practice. They could be very effective educators, and educators are a big need in our country. They can contribute to continuing education. They should all be exposed to the ideas of rural eye health, where 70% of our problem resides in the country, and the opportunities there to provide very effective solutions for their eye problems. We also have to expose them to other options in addition to clinical practice, research, technology innovation, low vision rehabilitation, etc. And all this should be followed by assessment. Atul Gawande in his book Better has identified these three core requirements for success in medicine. That is diligence, to do the right thing, and ingenuity. At no other time are these more critical than today's environment of post-COVID. The likely challenges, there would be preference by most patients for proximity to their homes. So there may be less demand for urban practices. There should be small urban and locations should have permanent facilities. And some of our colleagues, particularly those who are starting out their careers in ophthalmology, should be ready to accept lower compensations. So the future would be more permanent primary eye care centers, vision centers to replace eye camps, because large-scale eye camps will no longer be a solution. We should have more and more centers in rural areas at the secondary level. The tertiary centers should be smaller and no longer these big, huge complexes. Teleophthalmology should become routine. And we should also be ready to migrate the professionals from tertiary to secondary care, traveling to the smaller towns and rural areas. The World Report on Vision that's published by the World Health Organization this past year talks of an integrated people-centered care. That's the only way we can realize the aspirations of universal health, and in our case, universal eye health. And that's the model that we have built at our institute over the past 25 years, covering all levels of care from community-based primary care to advanced tertiary care, from screening in the remote rural communities to the management of complex diseases at the upper two tiers. A care that is appropriate to that level of care, available to all people, affordable and accessible, without compromising quality. So this is a way to go forward, and distributed care is going to be the theme for the future, for the success of delivery of eye care in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rao. It's a beautiful, well-concised, well-documented, and I must say that always a privilege to hear you speak on the concept of how we can reach out to the community. And I think we will take the questions for Dr. Rao's session now, if there are any. And then we will continue with the next talk. And I request Dr. Rao to introduce me for the next talk. So I have a question to ask you. During COVID, when your hospital was locked down for a couple of months in the first phase, and also during COVID, when you were able to open and keep social distancing, how did you find the response, and how were you able to financially sustain yourself?
That's the first thing we did, Aaron. As soon as the lockdown was announced, we were about to close down our routine services. We have sent out a communication to all the members of our staff from all cadres that their jobs are safe and their full salary will be protected throughout the period. And that we could do because of the lessons I have learned over the years, both within India and working with many international organizations in other countries, of keeping reserves for the rainy day. And that strategy has helped us to bide over the crisis. So after we had significant deficit at the end of the first 4 months until about August, and we began to recover. And in fact, by the end of the financial year, we had more surplus than the previous year. The recovery was much faster at the secondary and primary levels. Not surprising, I guess. We shouldn't have been surprised. Our secondary centers and primary centers in rural areas recovered between 120 to 170% pre-COVID volumes. And they have really helped us. And our tertiary care took a long while until nearly January, February of this year to get back to close to 100% of the pre-COVID levels. So that's going to be the picture in future. That's why distributed care, taking care closer to the doorstep of the people with high quality is going to be very critical.
Thank you very much, sir. So there's one more question they want to know. How does a hospital like yours is able to provide good quality complicated surgeries like vitreoretinal surgeries to the economically weaker section? These are expensive surgery with a lot of equipment. So does the cross-subsidy model work better in this, or do you have a system of supporting them?
All our operating expenses and all our non-paying care is covered by the money generated from our paying patients. Like we have a case study of the last financial year, that is 18-19. And a total of 54% of all surgical procedures in our network were provided absolutely free. And doing that, we recovered 91% of all operating expenses covering all our activities, not only patient care, education, research, rehabilitation, rural care, every activity that we are involved in. 91% of the operating expenses were covered by the money generated from the 46% paying surgeries that we had.
Thank you very much, sir. We appreciate that. And thank you for giving us your time. If there are any more questions, I'll give you a ring and call you back because I know you're very busy. And we always wanted to appreciate that you come. And once again, thank you on behalf of Team Arunodaya. Pleasure to have you, sir.
Thanks so much.
So now we have the next talk, and I request Dr. G.N. Rao to please introduce the next talk, which is on Arunodaya.
Yeah, I think Dr. Arun Sethi, again, he is among the ophthalmic leaders of our country. I think what is unique about him and his family is, while having a busy private practice in a big city like Delhi, he has made sure that he also worried about the societal good. Because often it is said in our profession, we have an opportunity, unique opportunity of doing well and also doing good. And he is the best example for that kind of a thing, doing well and doing good. And I believe he has passed on those genes to his next generation, and the two sons and their spouses, they all seem to be absorbed into the system. And of course, Reena Sethi is his better half in all senses, and she may be the force behind all these initiatives. So I welcome Dr. Arun Sethi to give us a talk on the Reaching the Unreached, the Team Arunodaya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. It's a pleasure to be introduced by a doyen like you. And you are the guiding spirit. This system that we started is a combination of what we saw in LVP and Arvind. So I'll be talking to you about this. And the interesting part is this is one of the few systems where private practitioners are doing community work since 1990 and still carrying on with it. Now, Reaching the Unreached is the Arunodaya saga and how it started. Arunodaya Charitable Trust was founded in November 1990 and was founded by me and my wife in collaboration. It was a really interesting thing that when we just started our practice after returning from our fellowship in Arvind, we were keen to do community work. And we were looking for a way, and they say that God opens the ways, as Dr. Natarajan was saying. And within a month of opening a clinic in Delhi, we had an American doctor visiting us on behalf of the US Embassy to certify a clinic for use. In that process, he brought his father, who we got talking, who said that he does community eye care work globally. And that was the genesis of the birth of the Arunodaya Deseret Partnership. So we saw our first patient under a tree. We had no table, no chair, no finances. And we were able to see about 14 poor patients who required cataract surgery. So the gentleman, Dr. Jackson, said, why don't you go ahead and operate and I will support you. So by doing the first case in a limited space near a house in a hospital where we were able to rent some space, resulted in the genesis of the birth of this collaboration, which went on to now reach out to 1.45 million patients. So I'm very grateful, and I wanted to just bring this out, that when you want to do something good for the community, there are ways and means of being able to do it. Now, about the organization, what are our objectives? We had very simple objectives because we realized that we have very limited means. So the first thing we did was to work on the reversal of the tide of avoidable blindness, which is cataract, increase the eye care awareness in the society, then also organize a system of knowledge and skill transfer. In 1990, if you remember, there were not that many CMEs, workshops, ways of learning. I myself had to travel all the way to Madurai from Delhi after coming back from abroad and to learn the simple art of how to do extracapsular cataract surgery under an operating microscope. So I said, we must have a system by which we can stop people from traveling and be able to learn the new techniques within their system so that they can keep upgrading their skills and be relevant. Because I realized that most of the senior doctors tend to become non-operating surgeons once techniques change, which does with quite frequency. And they do this because they're not in a position to upgrade the skills either because of lack of availability of training methods or patience or finances. The other thing was that at that time, most of the NGOs were focusing only on cataract surgery. We found that it's much better to do a comprehensive eye care, which included refractive errors, glaucoma, so that we could develop a comprehensive system which could then be used in developing an institute. Because by doing just cataracts, we would be very limited in our fields. So you can see that we conceived this idea of the eye care project, which is divided into 4 parts. The first was the village outreach program. As you know, that India resides in the villages, requires good quality eye care services there. So in the villages, we were able to provide a comprehensive eye screening by visiting them, create an eye care awareness. We would give out literature on how to take care of their eyes. We would be able to do basic refraction in glasses, especially for presbyopic patients, provide them basic eye medicines for irritation or tearing in the eyes and so on. And then if they needed any further referral, we would either refer them to the nearest government hospital where the facilities were available or call them to our base hospital. We then also went into school screening program. Now in the school screening program, we realized that the best way to do it is, I was at that time working very closely with Dr. Hans Limburg from Dunedin, because the Danish ambassador was my neighbor and he introduced us, and he was the one who wanted me to test this idea of training the teachers who could then through the e-chart take the vision of the students and come out with the patients or students who required further examination by the ophthalmologist. This he felt would be able to duplicate and extend the program over a wider footprint at a lesser cost and be more quick and effective, eliminating the need to go ahead and spend time on students who already had good eyesight. So we started doing this, and with God's grace, we had a program recently called They See, They Learn, in which we covered 62,000 children enrolled in schools, and we had a study taken out, which of course was done by examining each student through a very concise method. But we learned that we could then use the same e-charts by distributing them to the community. So we started printing them both in the vernacular, which is Hindi, and English. And we started giving these e-charts that I'll show you, printed on the back of a sheet which contained other information on good health to all the patients who visit our paid and free section, telling them to go home and check the eyes of the family, friends, associates, and staff. And believe me, it has worked, because over the years, nearly 5% of our patients are now coming in through the fact that they had their eyes checked through a small chart in the house, and they found that they had a problem with one eye. We also opened satellite centers in New Delhi, which is so we limited funds, which, it's very expensive property. We started identifying community sites like temples, schools, community centers, where we were asking for little space once a week where we could send our team. People could be advertised and brought in, and they checked, and we started this, and we still run the clinics in Mata Ka Mandir since 1990 without a stop. And we've been able to provide and expand into a 4-room set now, where we do most of the basic work of ophthalmology except surgery. We also have 2 mobile vans gifted to us by different organizations, which we are using during COVID. Of course, we couldn't use them much to do industrial screening, go into villages and conduct rural screening, go into corporate houses in Gurgaon and Delhi and screen their staff, and also provide eye care education and awareness through literature and audiovisual methods. Now, the base hospital is where I'm talking from, and which is located in Gurgaon at the moment, where we have a complete setup for eye care over 4 floors, similar to the on the lines of what Dr. Rao has explained at his institute or the other hospital like Shankar Netral and Arvind have, except that our size is much smaller. We have only 12,000 square feet, and we are able to conduct most of our work here by compartmentalizing them in different floors. So we have the poor and the subsidized patients on one floor. We have the paying patients on the another floor. We have the super specialized services like diabetic retinopathy, lasers, and all on another floor. And the 4th floor caters to surgeries and day care rooms where patients are kept. There is no difference in the quality of services. The only difference is in the quality of pampering. So it's on the lines of the airlines where you have a low-cost airline, you have an economy class, you have a business class, and in the first class, you are given wider seats, you're given better food and quality of service, but everybody reaches the destination safely. Similarly, our results about our work that we do, we try and keep and match them to see that they remain the same across all the sections of the society. Now, the village outreach program is very interesting. We have a very limited staff. We have a very small team. Most hospitals would send a reasonably large trip. They would have a system of multiple points of action like a registration, vision, and so on. But what they would also do is use local help. We found that in our area, getting local help is a little difficult because the attitude in where our area of operation north is very different from what we are seeing in the south. However, we were able to bring in government help through the Commission of Gurgaon and use ASHA workers to identify the patients, so that mostly we got to see those patients who had an eye issue already, rather than also screen the normal patients. So in the village outreach program had these various aspects. One was awareness building and patient sensitization. The other was a pre-camp campaigning to make them aware that we are coming. The training of local volunteers where they were available to be able to help us without coming in our way. Then conducting comprehensive eye care camps where we would do, even we would go to the extent of dilating them and checking their retinas and so on, providing them glasses or prescription, not only reading, but patients who would need the compound number would be prescribed glasses, and we would wear the glasses and go back and distribute them. Of course, those who required further investigation or treatment were referred to our base hospital, and we would always give them a sheet in the vernacular to go home and check the eyes of their family and friends and tell them how to take care of the eyes. So you can see how the camps are being organized. This is very similar to what is very common all over the country. These are the days before COVID, so you don't see any masks, you don't see social distancing. COVID brought our mobile eye care team to a grinding halt, and the previous presentation by Dr. G. V. Rao, our advisor, told you how we were trying to build up capacity during COVID. That's me examining the patient, and Dr. Reena examining another patient, and we have our team members examining patients. So we used to personally go along with all the camps. We would do them on a government holiday or a Sunday till the team started to grow and we had other doctors to go. And it's very interesting that the person on the top right here, which I'm showing you, is in the blue jacket, my teacher, Professor Erin Chatterjee, you know more, who taught me ophthalmology when I was doing my post-graduation in Christian Medical College, and would every year donate 2 weeks of his time and do volunteer work with us. And he would personally go conduct the camps, and he was a very, very finicky person who was known for maintaining top discipline and all that, and we learned a lot from him even otherwise. The foreigner that you see next to me in the picture in the corner here is Senator Mitt Romney, who ran for presidential US elections against President Obama for the second term. And the Senator Romney is from Utah and heads the organization. Now we work very closely with Charity Vision. And he was here along with the team 3 years ago and spent 4 days where he personally tried to learn how to examine patients and participate in the surgery. So you can see that we have the optical counter being displayed, we have the eye pharmacist doing with the medicines, and we have the office staff explaining all the things. But those who required surgery were brought to the hospital, as you can see. Then we would take their picture pre-op and we would do the picture post-op and then send them back. Now, of course, we do everything topically, so we open the patch before we send them home. So this is some of the current outreach we did in 2017 before when we started the program and we mapped out the zone we were going to work in. Now this is the school screening program that we have been doing, and we used to go and train the teachers, ask them to screen the students for us if required, and then go and do the refractions, the eye examinations and the referrals and give them free glasses whenever possible. Now we have an international school very near our hospital. We are in an area which has a beautiful golf course, high-rise buildings, corporate headquarters. In the middle of that, we're doing this work. So we invited these children from about 11 countries who study the school, mostly the ASEAN countries, to come and see, have their eyes checked, and to be able to do some kind of community interaction to get an idea. So you can see that providing this service has its own charm. It gives you an opportunity to go some of the finest places. It has enabled us to travel all the way to South Africa, where in KwaZulu-Natal, we did about 220 cataract surgeries over 3 days, and we were able to then reach out to many more.
We can't see your audio, so we can't hear your audio. I think we can skip the movie. That's okay. Running out of time.
So that gives you an idea of the work that we were doing. And so you can see in our satellite clinics, we have a system of doing refractions, basic screenings, and then referring them wherever required. Now, we're also working with the government and primary health centers. The primary health centers in India are places in villages where we have multiple rooms, and we have different kinds of doctors who come once a week, twice a week, and provide immunization services, pediatric services, and then we provide the eye care services in our district. This is our hospital. It's a very interesting story. When we had the land, we went looking for an architect, and during one of the American meetings, we met a very nice person called John Marasco, who had designed over 250 eye care centers in America. When he heard that we were trying to build a hospital with the community, he gave us the overall plans free of cost, which we then modified to the local zoning laws, and we created this wonderful institute, which has been there since 2006. We have expanded on another floor, and we're able to cater to up to 200 patients a day comfortably in this environment. So with these kind of things, you can see the interiors, we maintain them. We have a separate section for the non-paying section and the kind of work we do. And these are the kind of people and organizations who have come to help us. This is Dr. Jackson. I've been working with him since 1990. The man has never grown old. I have grown old. And he still comes every year with his team and works with us. So I just want to tell you that if you have the will to do it, like Dr. Rao showed us in LVP, Dr. Venkata Swami showed us in Aravind, and Dr. Badrinath showed us in Shankanetralaya, we can do that and make life more meaningful and have a good life. Thank you very much. The only thing they say that is worse than being blind is having sight but no vision. It's a very good quote, and I think we should all remember this in our work. So I would now request our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Aditya Sethi, who needs no introduction. And Dr. Aditya Sethi is the pediatric ophthalmologist who was trained in Shankanetralaya. And he has done both his residency and fellowship in pediatric ophthalmology. And he's now in charge of the post-COVID management along with Dr. G.V. Rao. And Dr. G.V. Rao presented on another track at the same conference on the effect of COVID-19. Dr. Aditya will now be speaking on the virus wars to COVID-19 and the Arunodaya battle plan. Over to Dr. Aditya.
Good afternoon, everybody from India, and thank you for the introduction, Dr. Anand. My topic is a little fun and not painful. It's the virus wars that is happening currently in the world, the pandemic COVID-19, and what is the battle plan that we have made to fight it at Arunodaya Desert Eye Hospital. So, so the overview of COVID-19 pandemic, we all know that it emerged suddenly out of the blue in the stage 1. It affected mainly China and surrounding countries. And by stage 2, it went all over the world. Stage 3, the pandemic accelerated, and by 4, it was a multifaceted virus with a lot of different strains causing a lot of problems. And the second wave, which India is still going through and still haven't recovered, we all had personal losses from. We also have the COVID-19 vaccines available now, which are the medical countermeasures available. So the current global situation is about 130 million cases already in the world, and 2.5 million deaths have already happened. This changes daily, and there's some days which are worse and some days which are bad. So what is the transmission characteristics of COVID-19? So before we talk about it, we should know how it spreads. So cough produces both large and small droplets. The smaller droplets do exist and take longer to dissipate. They remain in the air for more than 9 minutes, and the larger droplets settle faster and aerosols evaporate faster. How should your room be? Your examination room, if it's without ventilation, it takes 5 minutes for every droplet to reduce by 50%. And if it's poorly ventilated, about 1.5 minutes. And if it's well ventilated, 50% goes by 30 seconds. So it's a good idea to have a well ventilated room. The viral load also matters. A lot of us have this confusion. If somebody's not showing symptoms, he's asymptomatic, does he have any virus that he can give us? Yes, we know perfectly well that asymptomatic or symptomatic, your viral load makes you a carrier. And a high viral load is around this onset of symptoms and decreases after 10 days. So 3 C's to prevent cluster: avoid closed spaces with poor ventilation, avoid crowded places, and close contact or close range conversation should be avoided. What is the Arunodaya battle plan? We want to assure measures of employee safety, patient safety, housekeeping rules, and community and COVID relief projects that we've been doing to help the society, because we can't forget about where we come from. So measures taken from for employee and patient safety are divided among the COVID-19 consent form, training, which is to create awareness and educate regarding proper practices for this COVID-19, how to battle it, staff instruction pamphlets, precautions to be taken at home by everybody, and staff with fever or with close contact, we have to identify the high-risk group and we have to take care of them differently. So we have divided our staff into low risk, moderate, and high risk. The low risk are the security personnel, the inquiry desk, escorting personnel, medical, cash counter, housekeeping, admin, electricians. These are all those people who are not coming day-to-day contact with a lot of people. The moderate ones are the one who are doing thermal screening, the dispensing medicines, the one who is the registration counter, the vision screening they're doing the central fields and counseling. And the higher risk are the ones who are doing the triage. The doctors, the technicians in charge, the people who are doing optometrists doing refraction, blood pressure, and other investigations, the optical staff, the general anesthesia staff, the OT staff, the ambulance and lift operators. So daily screening and employing of the employees and patients being done at the hospital. We do thermal screening and we inform only if there's abnormality during screening. Symptom history is taken and is monitored. Any contact or travel history is taken. Personnel or people living in containment zones are earmarked, and history of fever among family members is also taken. For thermal screening, if we repeat twice if it's high, that's above 38 degrees Celsius or 100 Fahrenheit. In case of abnormality, we do isolate these staff members and we either send them home or we explain about the condition and isolate or give certain duties. Physician assessment, if vitals are stable and lungs are clear, and we can give them paracetamol, antibiotic, or over-the-counter medications to help deal with this. So dealing with symptoms, again, divided into mild, moderate, and severe. It doesn't take long for mild to become moderate and moderate to become severe. So we have to make sure that everybody is taking adequate precautions and the right therapy. So mild includes the myalgia, mild fever, fatigue, cold, headache. Moderate leads to breathlessness, high temperature, muscle soreness, and persistent cough. Severe can lead to chest pain and cyanosis and severe breathlessness. Also mental confusion, another severe symptom. And critical if once it leads to acute respiratory distress syndrome and then later sepsis. We also have to differentiate between the regular cold, flu, and COVID-19 if this table helps. So any COVID suspect or patient is immediately referred for the investigation if required, or isolation, or the hospital admission. A hospital admission is done for respiratory distress patients, for SpO2 less than 94, patients or employees with mental confusion, cyanosis, and chest pain. Mild cases are the confirmed RT-PCR cases, which are sent home for isolation. The social distancing at home, the HR follows up daily with telephonic summary from them. We explain about self-isolation to be followed in all activities, and proper disposal of their equipment, mask, and self-monitoring is being done. For facilities to be maintained in screening room, we have a screening room down in the basement where we take all the patients there first. We have a BP apparatus, stethoscope, NCT, pulse oximeter, crash cart, emergency medications, and we also maintain a register which is daily looked after by the in-charge system. Investigation protocol for employees, we went to do those with fever more than 3 days, shortness of breath, drop in saturation. We go ahead and do a CBC, probably consider a rapid test for COVID-19, chest X-ray and PA view. If we find anything, we go put them in, get a HRCT and RT-PCR done as soon as possible. Then normal, we put them for only observation. Critical alerts, shortness of breath again, cyanosis, respiratory rate more than 24, high fever, and SpO2 less than 94, and single breath count need to be referred and hospitalized as soon as possible. When can everybody return back to work? When there's no fever symptoms for 3 days or 10 days from onset of illness. And after 10 days, you don't need to really even repeat RT-PCR. If it's severe or critical, you need a repeated RT-PCR before joining duty. So what to do if you are in contact with a COVID-19 patient who's a high suspect? So in these cases, you have to only examine if there's an ocular emergency, where examination treatment is mandatory. A particular personnel is or health worker is notified for this, and that particular doctor goes inside wearing a PPE and assesses the eyes. And minimum number of staff should be there, and history and examination if patient is stable. The nodal officer has to be notified regarding patient's visit, who will coordinate with concerned local authority, which is government hospital. So if the patient turns out to be positive, we have a trace movement register where we find out exactly where the patient and who he's met or she's met, and those people have to be taken into isolation and looked after. An SOP is made if the health worker has been exposed, and how do we deal with it. So we identify the staff and we isolate them at home, or if we feel that there's less chance, we give them a particular job which requires isolation as well. So risk assessment of staff is to be done, whether they were using appropriate PPE or mask or whatever during that exposure. And we do RT-PCR, we repeat it, and if the staff does turn positive, another trace is done. Room sterilization after use, it's sterilized after isolation quarantine. We do hydrogen peroxide fumigation of the room for 20 minutes, 1% Lysol for the floor, 1% sodium hypochlorite for the bathroom, and 70% isopropyl alcohol for the instruments used. And room can be used after 24 hours again. The travel log is also taken because a lot of our staff is from different parts of India. So if they do travel, the area guidelines are taken into consideration. They need to be quarantined if required. Otherwise, RT-PCR has to be negative before they return to work. We also do a lot of community-based projects and COVID relief community projects. This is Dr. Arun with the Chief Minister of the state and the Commissioner of Gurgaon, with whom we've collaborated and we're distributing COVID relief kits amongst the needy. We also spread awareness of how to look after yourself during this very trying times. And that has also helped spread awareness about COVID-19, and I hope reduce the number of cases around us. Thank you so much. Now the COVID-19 vaccine is available, and I request everybody, whoever has a chance to get it, please go ahead and get the vaccine.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aditya, for a very, very concise, well-documented and very nice presentation. It's one of the few eye hospitals that Team Arunodaya has been able to distribute nearly 4,000 and going up to 5,000 kits for COVID, thanks to the local administration's help and some of our donors. And it's nice to know that while we were locked down for COVID, we were using that time under the guidance of our administrator, Monica, Dr. G.V. Rao, and the team to produce these COVID kits. So thank you once again. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker who needs no introduction. His name is Dr. Denny John. Denny is a health economist, and he has a long career behind him in healthcare. He started life from an ophthalmic institute, as I told you, which is the LVPEI. And now he's going to be telling us about the financial impact of COVID. India is a developing country. Healthcare in India is still being paid out of pocket by the poor. The government healthcare system does not able to reach out to most of the people in the villages and other areas. What impact has COVID-19 done in terms of the spending capacity? What is going to be the future implication of this in healthcare? And what direction we feel healthcare and especially eye care will take, considering that the second wave has been so debilitating? Over to Delhi now.
So I just made a small change, not much. I thought of just splitting it into economic and financial impact of COVID in our country. And I'll be focusing both on the overall economic impact and also the impact on the healthcare and the healthcare expenditure. So I'll be talking a bit about that as well. So just to highlight what has been the overall economic impact, last year, it started way back in 2020 once the national lockdown was announced. And at that particular time, India had an almost 23.9% contraction. Just to explain what is a contraction is basically because that the entire GDP squeezed, like it contracts to a smaller chunk in terms of the overall growth that particular year it could happen. So this is likely to affect other areas as well, because those who have coming from a bit of economics, if you have 1% growth in GDP, your expenditure on healthcare can go up to 10%. So that means that in a country like India, where people are dependent on out-of-pocket expenses and income being one of the factors for their affordability and access to healthcare, when you have an overall GDP contraction, it also means that people are less likely to spend on healthcare or might have less propensity to spend on healthcare unless it's absolutely necessary in terms of emergency or any kind of things. So compared to last year, this particular financial year, which is the Q1, because we are currently in June, so the Q2 is still not out. However, the Q1 is probably, and it might contract further in terms of the next year as well, because many of the fallbacks of the current economy will also affect the next year as well. So that's something that's going to affect in the larger economy as far as India is concerned. Now, that takes care of the overall economic impact, but what happens at the household level? So that's what I'm going to focus here. And one of the things that happened last year during the March-May 2020 was one of the world's strictest lockdown, which the government of India implemented as far as the entire country was concerned. And even in May to June 2021, currently I'm based in Kolkata, and till end of June, the lockdown has been extended. So lockdown bit varied because the lockdown was more focused on keeping the essential services open, but it was not the level of lockdown that we kind of saw compared to last year. Now, what happens during these lockdowns is that, of course, it is needed in some areas or some districts or some regions for reducing the transmissibility of infections. But the main trade-off is basically that it has got some what is called as short-run reductions in economic activity. So people, for example, who are daily wage earners like vegetable sellers, auto drivers, rickshaw pullers, even in some cases, for example, domestic workers which are not getting full salary because some of their employees are not given access to their homes, then these kind of reductions in economic activity actually have an impact, because most of the larger share of households in India depend on daily incomes, and we don't have the social security or a social protection compared to the European nations. So these kind of income deficits impact the household in the long run. At the same time, for the service industry, the practice of remote working, unless it's a service industry, is less prevalent. And also the extent of digitization is lower as compared to advanced economies. So it also restricts a lot of employees who could probably work from home. And I know that certain private banks, for example, have reduced the number of staff and laid it off. For example, I was traveling in Bombay during December, and I was told that many of the people, many of the staffs were actually asked to move during the lockdown last year for 2 months. So no salary paid. That is what the corporates decided so that they can save on their salaries. And then they reinstated them back again once the lockdown was open. So this is the kind of practice that's happening. I'm not aware of the extent of this issue for the current lockdown period that we're talking in 2021. However, this was very evident and prevalent in the year 2020. So these overall economic consequences have more bearing on the lower income population, the lower middle income population, and the middle income population might less be affected with the higher income and the richer population, because they also they basically sit on a lot of savings and deposits and other access to share market kind of avenues where their money can still be used for such eventualities. So this group in US, what they tried to do was they tried to look at using now those who know that during the lockdown, the country was divided, or for COVID, once the lockdown was lifted, many of the states went into what is called as a signal form of letting know what is the extent of the COVID cases in a particular district. So for example, I am more familiar with Kerala because that is the state that I'm focusing currently on for various of my economic studies. So for Kerala, for example, had few red zone districts, green zone districts, and orange zone districts. So basically what they did is that this particular group started to look at if there is something called as what is called as nighttime light intensity. Nighttime light intensity means that you start looking at these areas in the evening, and basically it means that people who can afford, kerosene or electricity are the people who are going to use this. So that is the logic for using the time light intensity. So people who are poor will traditionally not use their light to save on electricity so that they can save on their expenditure for electricity bills. So they use this as a proxy for aggregate economic activity during the last months of May to 2020, May to June 2020. So basically what they realized is after the assessment was that even after the lockdown, post-lockdown, was actually in the red zone districts, the economic recovery was actually lower by 9.3% compared to the green zone districts, which were having minimal restrictions. The same case for orange zone districts was 1.6% lower compared to the green zone districts. So even if they exclude the metropolitan or include the metropolitan cities or exclude it, these analysis did not change. And one of the reasons was lower household income, reduced consumption, some districts being more affected by restriction than others. And of course, this will also be dependent on what is the population density, which is above median of the income, share of employment in services, credit per capita, average age, experience, large, etc., etc. So that's the whole post who would be probably looking at this comparison to see how the current second wave and the post-lockdown scenario has affected the economic impact to the large sections of population. Now, what the last two slides what's trying to measure is what is the overall economic impact and what is the economic consequences. Now, when we also know that India is currently second after USA beat Brazil a couple of weeks back to being the second among the world for the largest number of cases, including the recoveries. Now, when we have so many cases recovering, you also have many of these people getting admitted to hospitals, some of them losing jobs because of their long-term illnesses. And this is what is called as the indirect economic burden due to COVID, or for that matter, any kind of infectious diseases. Now, these would means that apart from the direct expenditure that you're spending on hospitalization, or for example, or for a treatment, even on an outpatient basis, you have an indirect effect. For example, you have loss of income, or you also lose productivity because you're not producing any kind of product or having any kind of income activity during that period. So this is what we try to do. This is an ongoing paper. We have just received news that it will be accepted in the BMJ Open. And what we did was we focused in the state of Kerala to estimate what is the overall DALY's loss, what is the years of productivity, potential productivity lives lost. Simple, the YPLL is basically nothing but that if somebody dies at the age of 45, And if you assume that the retirement age is 60 years, then that particular family lost 16 years of the income of that particular individual. That is what the number of YPLL actually calculates. And the entire income that is lost because of 15 years of not having that member in the family is the calculation for cost for productivity loss. So this is the calculation that we did for Kerala. We have got news that it will be accepted in BMJ in the next couple of weeks, maybe few weeks down the line. But some of our initial findings was that the age, now this study was actually done in two phases. We actually, when we submitted the paper, we did it for December 2020, and then during the revision, we actually updated it for the June 10th till June 10th, 2021. So we found in both these areas that age groups 55 to 70 were highly affected both in number of cases and deaths. It's actually contributed almost 39.99% of the total number of cases and deaths in the country. And DALYs, which is basically a calculation of mortality and morbidity, the life years lost, which is years of life years lost, was the major component. The reason mainly because there were many cases, there were a huge number of cases of deaths reported in across all the age groups that we had assessed in the state of Kerala. And the highest contribution for DALYs was actually to the age group of 60 to 65 years population. So finally, what we had is a number that for COVID, the entire DALYs lost in Kerala was around 70.92 per million population. And this is based on the 2021 population estimates. However, many of the cases due to because of the deaths being happening in higher age groups, it was the years of productivity lives lost were actually low on the productivity age groups, which is basically the 25 to 49 years of age. However, because of the number of cases that these age group had and the income levels of these people, the cost for productivity was also kind of highest in the 40 to 49 years age group. So these are some of our initial findings, and probably if the group is interested, I can send the paper once the paper is published. We are also trying to attempt to do something similar for the India as whole, but it will also depend on the kind of data that is available with us in the public domain. So that basically gives us the indirect consequences or indirect impact of the economic burden of COVID. What I'm focusing on this particular slide is basically the direct health expenditure on COVID. And this reason is because India is one of the countries which has the lowest level of health insurance coverage. It has a high rate of people who have to depend on out-of-pocket expenditure. And because of this, you also have medical care being one of it's actually the third most reason for people to get poor in this particular, in India. So Indians spend a lot of things on vitamins. So a lot of expenditures happened while people lost their spending a lot of money. In the government did take a call in subsequent months, especially during the second wave, where they started doing what is called as a capping of services, and that's what you see on the left side, where the total cost was actually restricted in terms of not only the private public government hospitals. They anyway tried to do as much as possible for free. However, private hospitals were also expected to do some capping. But even then, you'll notice that isolation beds are currently being priced. These are Delhi rates, and this is for the month of May 2021. The isolation beds are between 8,000 to 20,000, 10,000. ICUs without ventilators are between 13,000 to 15,000, and for with ventilators, the bed cost is between 15,000 and 18,000, and these are including PPE costs. These are just the bed day, the hospitalization costs. You can imagine that once you add up treatment costs, drugs costs, doctor's consultation, any kind of investigations, the average expenditure for a particular individual might go up. Added to the fact that many of the insurance companies, although mention cashless, they refuse to, many of the hospitals refuse to go cashless. So for example, my personal experience has been the same. My father actually got admitted with stroke early part of this year. The hospital, due to low revenue last year, ended up taking a decision that you have to pay for admission, and then if you have insurance, you submit your bills for insurance later on for reimbursement. Now, how many of us could actually afford it? how many of the middle class can actually keep that kind of money when you have a whole year of low income and high expenditure, because everything else is going on. You have schools which need fees. You have food which needs to be bought. You have your house rent or EMIs for housing loans that needs to be paid. So this is the fourth impact that I wanted to highlight in terms of what has been the financial impact of COVID as far as health expenditure due to COVID has been concerned. Now, I think so because of this, there has been a lot of impact, and I just wanted to, like, for example, in Delhi, many families lost their life savings due to COVID because of their management. However, we also know that in public hospitals, although the treatment is quite free, however, the extent of the number of cases and which required hospitalization and treatment also exposed the lack of government investment in terms of equipment, facilities, and staff. And also, for example, you notice that in most of the ventilators are actually available only in private hospitals, and even those are concentrated in just 7 states. So basically what it means that most of the patients then have to go towards private hospital if they can afford it. Otherwise, they have nothing else to go. So where you have almost 85.9%, roughly around 85.9% of rural population, 80.9% of urban population with no insurance. India, for example, in 2011-12, which is around almost 44.1% of the population, or 50 million, are kind of in a state of hidden poverty due to medical expenses. And this number could go high if you actually compare the years 2020 and years 2021, given the huge impact of COVID as that has happened in terms of healthcare expenditure in the country. Finally, this is the last few seconds that I'm going to take. I think Dr. Rao already highlighted it. However, in the healthcare business, the COVID impact had some financial impact on the healthcare sector businesses as well. I don't have other ophthalmology examples, although I try to check it. But in terms of a paper published by Ahuja et al. In 2021, the radiology practice have seen a significant impact to the extent of almost 60 to 70% reduction in imaging volumes. And I'm sure that this hospitals like Arundhaya Hospital, LB Prasad, could also, because of their non-profit in nature, might have also impact on how many of the lower income populations could you actually serve compared to the previous years where you had a normal scenario you had normal scenarios in the previous years. Yeah, I think that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Delijon. It's been a very exhaustive and a very well-presented presentation. We will take the questions at the end of the next session. So in case there are any, we'll call you back, and we appreciate your contributing your time and effort in this. Our next speaker is Dr. Parul Lokwani, who needs no introduction. Dr. Parul Lokwani has been as a part of the team Arunodaya since many years and looks after the community outreach, and is also taking care with Dr. Neha on the COVID cases that are happening and the effect of mucormycosis, the so-called black fungus in ophthalmology. I request all the speakers to kindly stick to the time because we're running late. Dr. Parul Lokwani.
Thank you, sir, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Fungal in the COVID Jungle. I'll be talking briefly about mucormycosis and COVID-19 in my OPD. As an ophthalmologist, we are all sometimes maybe the first ones to come across these cases, and it's crucial that an early diagnosis is made, not only to save the vision but also to save the life of the patient. Here I'm discussing a couple of cases in which the patient tried to hinder the same. The first one is a 60-year-old male who came to our hospital with chief complaints of painful periorbital swelling in the right eye associated with vision loss. He had a negative perception of light with proptosis, ptosis, total ophthalmoplegia. He was a long-standing diabetic, but he denied the COVID history initially. Later on, MRI was done and nasal biopsy followed by culture, which confirmed that he had mucormycosis. And it was later when the patient agreed that he had undergone COVID earlier, and unfortunately the gentleman did not make it. Another case is of a 40-year-old female who came with diminution of vision in the left eye, lid swelling, and milder symptoms as compared to the previous case. She also complained of nasal stuffiness. She had recovered from COVID about 2 weeks back and had been on steroids for COVID related lung injuries. In the OPD, she refused to remove her mask and did not allow any further examination. It was only 2 days later when she came back with aggravated symptoms. And on examination, she was also confirmed to have mucormycosis. In this case, the patient was convinced for further investigations and near timely intervention was done. Rhinoorbital cerebral mucormycosis cases have been on a rise lately during the second wave of COVID-19. Secondary infections have been reported commonly in hospitalized severely ill COVID-19 patients. The government has already documented more than 8,800 cases by the end of May 21. Mucormycosis comes from the family Mucorrhaceae and the genera are Mucor, Exidia and Rhizopus. It is a life-threatening fungal disease that leads to angioinvasion, mycotic thrombosis and ischemic necrosis of tissues. The risk factors being hot and humid conditions, patients on steroids or voriconazole therapy, diabetics, COPD, neutropenia, immunocompromised patients like those of malignancy and organ transplant. In case of diabetes, hyperglycemia leads to impaired immune system, and in case of diabetic ketoacidosis, free iron is readily available in the serum, which is crucial for the virulence of fungal elements. Another risk factors are unhygienic mask and nasal cannula handling, patients on long-term high-flow oxygen, use of tap water at oxygen concentrators, general uncleanliness and lack of frequent hand hygiene. The signs and symptoms are foul smell, epistaxis, nasal stuffiness, nasal discharge, mucosal erythema, and inflammation. Black eschar on nasal turbinates is a characteristic sign. Facial and eyelid pain, edema and discoloration, headache, facial palsy. Some ocular symptoms are proptosis, ptosis, sudden loss of vision, diplopia, ocular motility restriction, ophthalmoplegia and diplopia, and fever. The complications being cavernous sinus thrombosis, multiple cranial nerve palsies, visual loss, frontal lobe abscess, and cavernous sinus thrombosis. The staging basically is first stage involving nasal mucosa, then the paranasal sinuses, stage 3 to the orbit, and finally the infection reaches the CNS. The diagnosis is done by direct microscopy with taking endoscopy guided nasal swab from paranasal sinus or orbital tissue. QOH wet mounts can be used where they are supplemented with fluorescent brighteners such as calcium white, which enhance the visualization of the characteristic fungal elements, which are seen as non-septate ribbon-like hyphae. This test is 90% sensitive, and obviously it requires a fluorescent microscope. Culture, mostly the mucorales are thermotolerant and they are able to grow rapidly within 3 to 5 days on most culture media such as sabots agar and potato dextrose agar. And rapid growth of fluffy gray colonies are seen. Hyphae are coarse and dotted with brown and black sporangia. Serology, basically there are no biomarkers for mucormycosis, but a negative beta D galactan and galactomannan biomarkers can be used to differentiate it from other fungi. Molecular diagnostic of tissue sample is PCR. Histopathic samples can be done using different stains. This is a confirmatory test and it shows broad-based ribbon-like non-septate hyphae with wide angle branching approximately at 90 degrees. CT scan and MRI are very important tests. CT is inspecific. It shows nodular mucosal thickening and bony erosion by the fungus. Nasal and paranasal mucosal thickening with irregular patchy enhancement is an early sign. On the MRI, we can see involvement of the orbital tissue, perineural tissue, and perineural spread. Also, we can see obstruction of the internal carotid artery. Ischemia non-enhancement of turbinates is a very characteristic sign. It is called as the black turbinate sign. Thickening of the medial rectus is early sign of orbital invasion. MRI and basically it is useful for to see the extent of cavernous sinus involvement and ischemic damage to the CNS. Prevention basically is environmental and patient related. In the environmental intervention, walls, roof must be dust and mold free. Avoid any waterlogging. AC vents must be cleaned and filters changed. Construction work should not be done where COVID patients are admitted. In case of patients, judicious use of systemic steroids, aggressive monitoring and control of diabetes mellitus, strict aseptic precautions while administering oxygen, and strict hand hygiene and wearing masks at all the times is very crucial. Also, in the case of patients, prophylactic oral posaconazole therapy can be considered in high-risk patients, especially those who are on mechanical ventilation or supplemental oxygen or steroids for more than 3 weeks, or patients of uncontrolled diabetes and those with immunosuppression. Management basically relies on rapid correction of underlying systemic abnormalities. Lipid-based amphotericin B, which destroys the cell wall of fungus, is a first-line medical treatment for mucormycosis and should be initiated as soon as the diagnosis is suspected. High doses are required, but liposomal formulations may deliver high doses while protecting the renal function. Posaconazole is a newer triazole which inhibits the growth of fungus, and it is used basically as an adjunctive or as a maintenance therapy, and also in cases of unresponsive amphotericin B for 7 to 23 weeks. Those requiring surgical debridement, all the necrosed tissue is removed, and the surgery may also be done for aggressive debridement of paranasal sinuses, turbinectomy, palatal and orbital wall resection with clear margins, followed by supportive treatment, that is liposomal amphotericin B 5 to 10 mg per kg body weight for minimum 4 weeks, followed by step down treatment with oral posaconazole for 6 weeks to 6 months according to clinical and radiological regression. For a life-threatening infection such as mucormycosis, it is important to carry a high degree of suspicion, timely diagnosis, and followed by aggressive management, and this requires coordination with different other departments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parul. Very detailed, well organized, well documented. You're requested to smile on the screen. Thank you very much. And we thank the team Media Mice for all their help and for the kindness. And we now request Dr. Parul and everybody to please come on the screen for a screenshot so the next session can start. All the best.